Khaleesi had barely slept. Between her night shifts as a security guard and her daytime classes to become a doctor, exhaustion weighed heavy on her. But her mother's worsening illness kept her moving. She needed the money to cover the hospital bills, and Khaleesi was used to carrying the weight of her family's struggles. Tonight felt like any other night as she patrolled the parking lot of one of the city's grandest buildings, where her boss, Christian, ran a successful real estate company. Just as she was about to finish her patrol near the luxury cars parked by the main entrance, something unusual caught her eye. A thick envelope was lying near the driver's seat of one of the most expensive cars in the lot, almost hidden under the seat. Khaleesi picked it up, her breath catching in her throat as she opened it. Inside was a stack of cash, far more than she'd ever seen in one place. Her heart raced. This money could change everything. Her mother's medicine, the overdue hospital bills, her tuition, everything could be covered if she took this envelope. No one would ever know, and it would solve so many problems. The temptation clawed at her, making her fingers grip the envelope tighter. But after a long pause, she sighed, shaking her head. It wasn't hers. Khaleesi marched back to her security station, holding the envelope tightly. Her fellow guards teased her as soon as they saw what she had found. "Why would you return it?" one of them laughed. "No one would have known it was missing." Another guard chimed in, chuckling. "That's more money than you'll ever make. It could have been a gift from the universe." Khaleesi shrugged them off. She had always been taught to do the right thing, no matter how hard it was. "It's not mine," she said, handing the envelope to her boss, the head of security. Her voice was steady, but inside, she knew how hard it had been to make that choice. Her boss raised an eyebrow, impressed by her integrity. "I'll report this," he said, glancing at the envelope. "But I'm going to make sure Mr. Christian hears about this." The next day, Christian, the CEO of the real estate company, was shocked when he learned about the envelope. He was a man used to people taking advantage of his wealth, and the idea that someone in Khaleesi's position would return such a large sum of money intrigued him. When he finally saw her, he was even more surprised. Khaleesi wasn't just another guard. She carried herself with quiet strength and grace that didn't fit the image he had in his mind. How could someone so young and beautiful be working such a tough job? Later that day, Christian decided to meet her in person. He walked up to Khaleesi, who was doing her rounds, and introduced himself. "You must be Khaleesi," he said, his voice warm but curious. "I wanted to thank you for what you did yesterday. Returning that envelope was incredibly honest of you." Khaleesi, surprised by his presence, nodded politely. "I was just doing my job," she replied. Christian smiled, offering her a small envelope as a token of thanks. "I insist you take this." But Khaleesi shook her head. "No, really. I don't need a reward. It's what anyone should have done." For the first time, Christian found himself unsure of what to say. Khaleesi's honesty and quiet humility stuck with him, and as he walked away, he couldn't stop thinking about her. There was something different about Khaleesi, something that pulled at him in a way he couldn't explain yet. Weeks passed after Khaleesi's encounter with Christian. She continued her long hours as a security guard and worked even harder at her studies. Becoming a doctor wasn't just a dream, it was her way out. A way to ensure no one else in her family had to suffer from a lack of proper health care. But no matter how hard she worked, her thoughts kept drifting back to that brief meeting with Christian. There was something about the way he'd thanked her. He seemed genuinely impressed by her honesty. She had grown used to people overlooking her, but Christian had been different. Little did she know, Christian couldn't stop thinking about her either. He had heard stories of people trying to take advantage of his family's wealth, but Khaleesi had returned a large sum of money without hesitation. He started to wonder more about her life. It wasn't just her beauty that intrigued him, but the strength and resolve she carried within her. He began asking his assistant about Khaleesi, hoping to learn more without being too obvious. His assistant came back with the details. Khaleesi was working nights as a security guard and studying during the day to become a doctor. Her mother was seriously ill, and Khaleesi was doing everything she could to support her family while pursuing her education. Christian was impressed by her determination, but he also knew that life wasn't easy for her. He wanted to help, but he understood that Khaleesi wasn't someone who would accept charity. She had already refused his offer of a reward, and he could see that she took pride in her independence. After much thought, Christian came up with an idea. He approached Khaleesi one evening as she was finishing her shift. "Khaleesi," he started, catching her attention, "I was wondering if you'd be interested in taking on an additional role here at the company." Khaleesi blinked, surprised. "What kind of role?" "I need an assistant," Christian explained. "Someone I can trust to help me with day-to-day tasks. You're hardworking and reliable, and I think you'd be perfect for the job." Khaleesi hesitated. The offer was tempting. The extra money would make a huge difference in her life, helping her pay for her mother's treatments and her tuition. But she wasn't sure if accepting would be the right decision. Working so closely with Christian would blur the lines between her professional duties and personal life, and that thought made her uneasy. Sensing her hesitation, Christian smiled gently. "I'm not offering this as a favor, Khaleesi. You'd earn it. I just need someone I can count on, and I believe you're that person." After a long pause, Khaleesi nodded. "All right. I'll take the job." The days that followed were busy. Khaleesi juggled her new responsibilities with her security duties and her studies. She found herself spending more time around Christian, working closely on various projects. He was always kind and respectful, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind the way he looked at her. One evening, after a long day of work, Khaleesi found herself alone in the office with Christian. They had both been working late, and the soft glow of the desk lamps created a warm atmosphere in the otherwise empty room. As she finished organizing some files, Christian walked over with 2 cups of tea. "Chamomile," he said, handing her one. "You mentioned it's your favorite." Khaleesi blinked, surprised. She hadn't even remembered mentioning that to him, but somehow Christian had. A small smile tugged at her lips as she accepted the cup. "Thank you," she said softly, taking a sip. The warmth of the tea spread through her, and for the first time in a while, she felt herself relax. Christian watched her for a moment before speaking again. "You've been working really hard, Khaleesi. You deserve a break." Khaleesi looked up at him, meeting his eyes for the first time that night. There was something in his gaze, something that made her heart skip a beat. She quickly looked away, unsure of what to make of the moment. But as the quiet between them stretched, Khaleesi couldn't help but wonder if this connection, whatever it was becoming something more. Khaleesi's new role as Christian's assistant came with challenges, but it also opened a new world for her. She was no longer just a security guard, she was working alongside the CEO of a powerful real estate company. As the weeks passed, she began to understand the inner workings of Christian's world, though she still felt like an outsider. Despite her new responsibilities, Khaleesi couldn't ignore her primary focus, becoming a doctor. Late nights were spent studying, and every spare moment was dedicated to her education. Balancing work, studies, and taking care of her mother became harder, but she refused to let anything fall behind. Still, her time with Christian was different from what she expected. They shared more quiet moments than she thought they would, and each one left her more curious about him. One night, the office was quiet. Most of the staff had already left, but Christian and Khaleesi remained. She was going through some paperwork when Christian walked over to her desk. He placed a cup of tea next to her, the familiar scent of chamomile filling the air. "You need a break," Christian said softly, sitting on the edge of her desk. Khaleesi smiled, though she felt tired. "Thank you, but I really need to finish this." Christian shook his head. "You've been going non-stop for weeks. It's okay to take a moment." There was something in his tone that made Khaleesi pause. He wasn't just talking about the work. There was an underlying concern in his voice, something that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't experienced before. She slowly closed the file in front of her and leaned back in her chair, holding the cup of tea close to her chest. "You work hard, Khaleesi," Christian continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "It's admirable, but you don't have to carry everything alone." Khaleesi's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure how to respond. No one had ever spoken to her like that, like they understood the weight of her responsibilities. She looked away, not wanting him to see the vulnerability in her eyes. "I'm fine," she replied after a moment. "I can handle it." Christian smiled gently. I know you can, but you don't always have to. There was a long silence between them. Khaleesi sipped her tea, the warmth seeping into her bones. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to relax, if only for a moment. But as the quiet stretched on, she found herself wondering about Christian. He wasn't what she expected from someone in his position. He was thoughtful, attentive, and most importantly, he didn't treat her like an outsider. She began to see that beneath his polished exterior, there was something deeper, something genuine. As the night drew on, they continued to work in comfortable silence. Christian occasionally glanced her way, but neither of them said much. It was a simple evening, but it was one that stayed with Khaleesi. It was in these quiet moments, where words weren't necessary, that something between them began to grow. It wasn't romantic yet, but the connection was undeniable. By the time they finally packed up to leave, Khaleesi found herself feeling more at ease with Christian than she had before. As she stepped out of the office, the cool night air brushing against her face, she realized something that unsettled her. Christian had become someone she didn't just admire. He was someone she was starting to care for deeply, in a way she hadn't allowed herself to before. But as much as Khaleesi wanted to explore these feelings, she reminded herself of the reality of their situation. Christian was her boss. He was also part of a world she didn't belong to. No matter how kind or caring he seemed, the gap between them was wide, and she wasn't sure if it could ever be bridged. As her relationship with Christian deepened, Khaleesi found herself caught between two worlds. At work, she was confident, professional, and able to handle any challenge thrown her way. But outside of work, in Christian's social circle, she felt out of place. The glamorous events, the expensive clothes, and the casual luxury that surrounded him, it was all so far from her own life that it felt like a different universe. One evening, Christian invited Khaleesi to a formal dinner hosted by his family. She had hesitated at first, knowing that his world was one she didn't quite fit into. But Christian had insisted, saying it was just a casual event. Khaleesi had agreed, but as soon as she arrived, she knew this wasn't just another dinner. The house was massive, a sprawling mansion with high ceilings and chandeliers that sparkled in the evening light. Guests were dressed in designer clothes, their jewelry glittering as they moved gracefully around the room. Khaleesi had worn her nicest dress, but compared to the others, she felt plain and underdressed. She stood by the edge of the room, her heart racing as she tried to blend in. It wasn't long before Christian's mother approached her, a polite smile on her face. "Khaleesi, I'm glad you could make it," she said, her voice smooth and elegant. Khaleesi forced a smile in return. "Thank you for having me." Christian's mother glanced around the room, her eyes landing briefly on the other guests, before returning to Khaleesi. "It must be overwhelming," she said lightly, as though discussing the weather. "I imagine this is all very different from what you're used to." Khaleesi's stomach twisted. She nodded, unsure of how to respond. "I'm sure Christian appreciates your help at the office," Christian's mother continued. "He speaks highly of you." "Thank you," Khaleesi said, her voice barely above a whisper. Christian's mother smiled again, though it didn't reach her eyes. "It's wonderful that you've been such a support to him." As she walked away, Khaleesi felt the weight of her words sink in. It wasn't a compliment. It was a reminder. She wasn't part of this world. She wasn't someone Christian's family would ever truly accept. To them, she was just an assistant. A girl who had worked her way up from security guard, but who would never be their equal. Khaleesi's chest tightened as she looked around the room. Everywhere she turned, she felt out of place. These weren't her people. This wasn't her life. She didn't belong here, no matter how much Christian insisted otherwise. That night, as Christian spoke with his friends and family, Khaleesi slipped out of the house. She needed air. Needed space from the overwhelming pressure that seemed to suffocate her. As she stood outside in the cool night, she realized something that broke her heart. No matter how much she cared for Christian, she didn't belong in his world, and she wasn't sure if she ever could. Khaleesi's mind raced as she left the dinner early. Christian had noticed her slipping away, but she had made an excuse, telling him she needed to check on her mother. The truth was, she couldn't bear to stay in that room any longer. The looks, the subtle comments, They all reminded her of the widening gap between her and Christian. As she walked down the empty street, her heels clicking softly on the pavement, Khaleesi replayed the night in her head. The way Christian's family had treated her wasn't outright cruel, but it was clear they didn't think she was good enough for him. They saw her as someone beneath them, someone who didn't fit into their perfect, wealthy world. And maybe they were right. Khaleesi stopped at the corner, the weight of the evening pressing down on her shoulders. She leaned against the street lamp, staring out at the empty road ahead of her. Her heart ached, not just because of how she was treated, but because of what it meant for her relationship with Christian. "He don't belong," her mind whispered. "He deserves someone who fits into his world. Someone who doesn't have to fight to prove they're worthy." The thought made her chest tighten. She had worked so hard to build a life for herself, to create opportunities for her family. But no matter how much she achieved, no matter how hard she worked, she would never be like the people in Christian's world. She would never have their wealth, their status, or their privilege. And because of that, she would always feel like an outsider. Khaleesi's phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Christian. "Where did you go? Are you okay?" Her fingers hovered over the screen, her heart aching as she thought about what to say. She knew Christian cared about her, but caring wasn't enough. She didn't fit into his life, and trying to force it would only hurt them both in the end. "I'm fine," she typed back. "I just needed some air. I'll talk to you tomorrow." As she sent the message, tears welled up in her eyes. She hated feeling like this, so insecure, so unsure of herself. But no matter how much she tried to push the doubts away, they always came back stronger. By the time Khaleesi arrived home, she had made up her mind. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. She couldn't keep acting like she belonged in Christian's world when she knew she didn't. If she stayed with him, if she continued this relationship, it would only get harder. She would always feel like she had to prove herself. And eventually, Christian would see it too. He would see that she wasn't enough for him. Khaleesi sat on the edge of her bed, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone. She needed to end this before it went any further, before she got hurt even more. Her heart pounded as she typed out the words she never thought she'd have to say. "Christian, I think we should take a break. I need some time to figure things out." She stared at the message, her vision blurred with tears. Every part of her wanted to delete it, to pretend everything was fine and keep going. But deep down, she knew it was the right thing to do. Taking a deep breath, Khaleesi hit send. The message disappeared, and with it, a part of her heart broke. She didn't know if she'd ever be able to fix it. The days that followed were filled with an unbearable silence. Khaleesi had sent her message to Christian, and while he had responded with confusion and concern, she hadn't been able to bring herself to explain why she needed space. Her mind was in a whirlwind of doubt and guilt, and the more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that she was doing the right thing. Khaleesi avoided Christian as much as she could. At work, she remained professional, keeping their conversations limited to business matters. But every time she saw him, her heart ached. The way he looked at her, with worry and confusion in his eyes, only made it harder to maintain the distance she had created. Late one evening, Khaleesi sat alone in her apartment, her textbooks scattered across the table in front of her. She was supposed to be studying, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She couldn't stop thinking about Christian, about the life they could have had together if things were different. But things weren't different. She wasn't the kind of woman his family would accept, and no matter how much Christian insisted otherwise, she knew deep down that it would never work. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was Christian. He had been calling her more frequently lately, trying to understand what had gone wrong. Khaleesi stared at the screen, her heart racing as she debated whether or not to answer. After a long moment, she let the call go to voicemail. She couldn't face him. Not yet. Instead, she opened her messages and typed out a short reply. "I'm sorry, Christian. I just need some time. Please understand." The message felt cold and distant, but Khaleesi didn't know how else to explain her feelings. How could she tell him that she wasn't enough for him? That his world was too different from hers, and that being with him only reminded her of how much she didn't belong? As the days turned into weeks, Khaleesi's resolve began to waver. She missed Christian. She missed the way he made her feel. Like she was more than just a girl struggling to get by. But every time she thought about reaching out to him, the doubts resurfaced. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was holding him back, that he deserved someone who could truly fit into his life without feeling like an outsider. One evening, after another long day at work, Khaleesi sat on the couch, her heart heavy with regret. She thought about Christian, about the way he had always been there for her, even when she tried to push him away. Tears filled her eyes as she realized how much she had lost by pulling away from him. But no matter how much she missed him, she couldn't ignore the truth. She couldn't be the woman he needed, not with the gap between their worlds looming over them. And as much as it hurt, Khaleesi knew that walking away was the only option. With a heavy heart, she wiped away her tears and made a decision. She would tell Christian the truth, even if it meant breaking both of their hearts. Christian had always prided himself on being able to solve problems. As the head of a major real estate company, he had faced challenges that would have overwhelmed most people, but when it came to Khaleesi, he was at a loss. Ever since Khaleesi had asked for space, Christian had been trying to figure out what had gone wrong. He couldn't understand why she was pulling away from him. They had been getting closer, sharing more moments of vulnerability and connection. But now, she was distant, and no matter how hard he tried to reach her, she kept him at arm's length. Christian paced in his office, his mind racing. He had replayed their last few conversations over and over again, trying to pinpoint the moment when things had changed. But nothing made sense. Khaleesi had always been strong, independent, and driven. She wasn't the kind of person who would give up on something without a reason. He glanced at his phone, hoping for a message from her. But it remained silent. Christian sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew something was wrong, but Khaleesi wouldn't talk to him about it. And the more she pushed him away, the more helpless he felt. That evening, as he sat alone in his office, Christian made a decision. He wasn't going to let Khaleesi slip away without a fight. He knew there was something deeper going on, something she wasn't telling him. And if she wouldn't come to him, then he would go to her. The next day, Christian asked his assistant to arrange a quiet dinner, just the two of them. He didn't want it to be anything extravagant, just a chance to talk. To really talk. When Khaleesi arrived at the restaurant, Christian could see the hesitation in her eyes. She looked tired, like she had been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. He stood up to greet her, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and anxiety. "I'm glad you came," Christian said softly, pulling out a chair for her. Khaleesi smiled weakly and sat down, avoiding his gaze. They ordered their food, but neither of them touched it. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken words and lingering doubts. Finally, Christian spoke. "Khaleesi," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't understand why you're pulling away from me. I thought things were going well between us, but now it feels like you're shutting me out." Khaleesi looked down at her hands, her chest tightening with guilt. "I'm not trying to hurt you," she whispered. I don't think I belong in your world." Christian's heart clenched. He had feared this was the reason behind her distance, but hearing it aloud made it all the more real. "Khaleesi, you're not just part of my world," he said gently. "You're my world." After their quiet dinner, Christian realized how much Khaleesi's insecurity about fitting into his world had been affecting their relationship. She had been pushing him away because she believed she didn't belong in his life. But Christian knew that couldn't be further from the truth. He loved Khaleesi for who she was, not for where she came from. And it was time he showed her, and everyone else, how much she meant to him. A few weeks later, Christian's family hosted another formal event, and despite her reluctance, Khaleesi agreed to attend. She hadn't wanted to go, but Christian had insisted that she come with him. She had spent the entire evening feeling out of place, just as she had before. The polite smiles, the whispered comments behind her back, it was all too much. Khaleesi had been planning to leave early when Christian suddenly appeared beside her. He could see the discomfort in her eyes, the way she was holding herself apart from the crowd. Without a word, he took her hand and led her to the center of the room. Before Khaleesi could protest, Christian raised his voice so everyone could hear him. "I need to say something," he began, his tone commanding the attention of the room. "Khaleesi isn't just my assistant. She's not just someone who works for me. She's the most important person in my life." A hush fell over the room as everyone turned to look at them. Khaleesi's heart raced as Christian continued. "I know some of you have been questioning why she's here," he said, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "I've heard the whispers, and I've seen the way some of you look at her. But let me make one thing clear. Khaleesi belongs here. She belongs with me." Khaleesi's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected Christian to say any of this, to publicly defend her in front of his family and friends. Her chest tightened with emotion as she realized the depth of his feelings for her. Christian turned to her, his eyes softening as he spoke directly to her. "I love you, Khaleesi, and I don't care what anyone else thinks. You're not just part of my life. You're my future." Tears filled Khaleesi's eyes as Christian's words sank in. For so long, she had doubted whether she truly belonged in his world. But here he was, standing up for her in front of everyone, showing her that she wasn't just some outsider. She was the woman he wanted to be with, no matter what anyone else thought. The room was silent as Christian finished his speech. Khaleesi could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her. But for the first time, it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was Christian, the man who had just shown her that their love was stronger than any doubts or differences. With tears streaming down her cheeks, Khaleesi wrapped her arms around Christian, pulling him into a tight embrace. In that moment, she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. In the days following Christian's public declaration, Khaleesi felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She had spent so much time doubting herself, convinced that she didn't belong in Christian's world. But now, with Christian's unwavering support, she started to see things differently. Maybe she didn't have to fit into a specific mold to be worthy of love. Maybe, just maybe, she could be enough as she was. Christian, true to his word, continued to stand by Khaleesi's side, showing her in both big and small ways that he was committed to their relationship. But there was still one thing he hadn't told her, something he had been planning for months. He wanted to wait for the right moment to reveal it. And now, after everything they had been through, that moment had finally come. One evening, Christian picked Khaleesi up after work and took her on a drive. They hadn't spoken much about the future, but Christian had something special in mind, and he couldn't wait to share it with her. As they drove through the city, Khaleesi watched the buildings pass by, her curiosity growing with each mile. "Where are we going?" she asked, glancing at him. Christian smiled but didn't answer right away. "You'll see." After about 20 minutes, they pulled up in front of a new building that Khaleesi had never seen before. It was modern, with large glass windows and a welcoming entrance. There was a sign above the door, but from where she sat, Khaleesi couldn't quite make out what it said. Christian parked the car and turned to her, his expression serious but filled with warmth. "Come with me," he said softly. Khaleesi followed him out of the car, her heart racing with anticipation. As they approached the entrance, she finally saw the sign clearly. Her breath caught in her throat as she read the words, "The Khaleesi Foundation Hospital for Families in Need." For a moment, Khaleesi couldn't move. Her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. She turned to Christian, her eyes wide with disbelief. This is..." Christian nodded, his voice soft but steady. "It's for you. I built this hospital in your name. It's a place where families like yours, like mine, can come and get the care they need, no matter their financial situation." Tears filled Khaleesi's eyes as she looked back at the sign. She couldn't believe it. Christian had built an entire hospital in her name, a hospital that would help the very people she had always dreamed of serving. She turned to him, her voice trembling with emotion. "You did this? For me?" Christian stepped closer, gently taking her hands in his. "I did it for us. I know how much you've sacrificed to become a doctor, how hard you've worked to take care of your mother and pursue your dream. I wanted to help you build that dream." Khaleesi's tears flowed freely as she stared at Christian, her heart overflowing with love and gratitude. She had always believed that she didn't belong in his world, but now she realized that Christian had been building a world for them all along. Khaleesi stood in front of the hospital, her heart pounding with emotion. She had spent years dreaming of becoming a doctor, of helping families who couldn't afford health care, and now, standing in front of a hospital that bore her name, she felt like she was standing on the edge of that dream, becoming a reality. Christian stood beside her, his hand gently resting on her back as he watched her take it all in. He knew how much this meant to her, how much she had sacrificed to get to this point. And he wanted her to know that she didn't have to do it alone anymore. "I know you've always felt like you had to carry everything on your own," Christian said softly. "But you don't have to anymore. I'm here, Khaleesi. I'm here to help you build the life you've always wanted." Khaleesi turned to him, her eyes filled with tears. I never thought anyone would do something like this for me." Christian smiled, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You deserve it, Khaleesi. You deserve all of this and more." For so long, Khaleesi had believed that she wasn't enough, that she had to prove herself to be worthy of Christian's love. But now, standing in front of the hospital, she realized that she didn't have to prove anything. Christian loved her for who she was, and he believed in her dream just as much as she did. With a deep breath, Khaleesi walked toward the entrance of the hospital, Christian by her side. As they stepped inside, she was greeted by the sight of the bright, welcoming space that would soon be filled with patients and doctors, all working toward the same goal: providing care for families in need. The hospital was more than just a building. It was a symbol of everything Khaleesi had worked for, everything she had sacrificed for. And now, thanks to Christian, that dream was finally coming to life. As they toured the facility, Christian explained the different departments and programs that had been set up, all designed to provide affordable health care to families who couldn't otherwise afford it. Khaleesi listened, her heart swelling with pride and gratitude. "This is everything I've ever wanted," she whispered, tears filling her eyes once again. Christian smiled, pulling her into a gentle embrace. "I know, and now it's yours." Khaleesi rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. She had spent so long doubting herself, but now, with Christian by her side and the hospital before her, she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. In the days that followed the hospital's grand opening, Khaleesi found herself reflecting on everything that had brought her to this moment. For so long, she had believed that she wasn't enough, that she didn't belong in Christian's world. But now, with the hospital standing as a testament to their love and partnership, she realized that she had been wrong. Christian had never wanted her to change or fit into a specific mold. He had loved her for who she was from the very beginning. Her strength, her determination, and her unwavering commitment to her dream of becoming a doctor. And in return, he had given her the support and resources she needed to make that dream a reality. Khaleesi sat in her new office at the hospital, surrounded by the bustle of doctors, nurses, and patients. She watched as families came through the doors, seeking care and comfort in the place she had helped create. Her heart swelled with pride as she realized the impact she was making, not just on her own life, but on the lives of countless others. But as much as the hospital meant to her, Khaleesi knew that it was only part of what made her life complete. The other part was Christian, the man who had stood by her side through it all, who had believed in her, even when she didn't believe in herself. As she sat at her desk, her phone buzzed with a message from Christian. "How's the first week going?" Khaleesi smiled, typing out a quick reply. "Busy, but amazing. Thank you for everything." Christian's response came almost immediately. "I'm proud of you, Khaleesi. You've earned this." Khaleesi leaned back in her chair, her heart full of gratitude. For so long, she had been afraid that she wasn't enough, that she couldn't live up to the expectations placed on her by Christian's world. But now, she knew that those fears had been unfounded. She had built a life that was meaningful and fulfilling, and she had done it on her own terms. With a deep breath, Khaleesi stood up and walked out of her office, ready to face the challenges ahead. She knew that there would be difficult days when the weight of her responsibilities would feel overwhelming. But she also knew that she wasn't alone. She had Christian by her side, and together they could face anything. As the months passed, Khaleesi and Christian settled into a new rhythm. The hospital continued to grow, serving more families in need each day, and Khaleesi found herself fully immersed in the work she loved. She had finally achieved her dream of becoming a doctor, and every day brought new challenges and opportunities. But what made it even more special was the fact that she wasn't doing it alone. Christian was there, every step of the way, supporting her and encouraging her to pursue through her passion. He had become more than just a partner in her personal life. He was a partner in her dream. One evening, after a long day at the hospital, Khaleesi returned home to find Christian waiting for her with a smile on his face. He had been busy with his own work, but he always made time for her, no matter how hectic their schedules became. "I made dinner," he said, holding out a plate for her. Khaleesi laughed, shaking her head as she accepted the plate. "You're too good to me." Christian shrugged, his eyes twinkling with affection. "You deserve it." As they sat down to eat, Khaleesi couldn't help but think about how far they had come. There had been moments when she had doubted whether they could make it, whether their worlds were too different to truly come together. But now, sitting beside Christian in their shared home, she knew that those doubts were behind her. They had built something strong, something that had withstood the pressures of both their lives. And as they talked and laughed over dinner, Khaleesi realized that she had everything she had ever wanted. After dinner, they went for a walk in the cool evening air. The streets were quiet, and the sky was painted with the soft glow of the setting sun. As they walked hand in hand, Khaleesi felt a sense of peace wash over her. "I'm proud of you, Khaleesi," Christian said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. Khaleesi smiled, leaning into him. "I'm proud of us." As they continued walking, Khaleesi knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. They had already overcome so much, and their love had only grown stronger because of it. With Christian by her side, Khaleesi knew that anything was possible. And as they walked into the future, she felt more certain than ever that they were exactly where they were meant to be. If you enjoyed this story of love, sacrifice, and the power of dreams, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to TR World. Share your thoughts below, and let us know what kind of stories you'd like to hear next. Stay tuned for more heartwarming tales that inspire, entertain, and remind us of the beauty of life's unexpected journeys.